Small dense LDL particles also remain in the bloodstream longer, which increases their susceptibility to oxidation, a type of biochemical damage. You've seen oxidation, like when certain metals rust or when an apple or avocado turns brown when exposed to air. This process also happens inside the human body, and lipoproteins that carry cholesterol can become similarly damaged, as can DNA and structural fats in our cell membranes. Researchers have found that the majority of studies show a positive association between elevated small, dense LDL particles and CHD risk. The greater the amount of small dense LDL, the greater the risk for CHD. And so when people cut back on saturated fat, which generally causes an increase in the harmful small dense LDL particles, they may actually be increasing their risk for heart disease. One study even showed that men with pattern A large buoyant LDL particles who go on a low-fat, high-carb diet show an increase in those harmful pattern B small dense LDL particles. As if that wasn't a big enough nail to drive into the coffin of the saturated fat is bad for you myth. In these men, the low-fat, high-carb diet also raised triglycerides and lowered HDL, indicating a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. Like everything else we've discussed so far, this isn't a simple black and white issue. High triglycerides on their own may be problematic for heart health. Low HDL may be problematic for heart health, but taken together, the risk of cardiovascular disease is multiplied, not added. A low-fat, high-carb diet will increase your cardiovascular risk, not lower it. This is especially true if saturated fat is replaced by refined carbohydrates, a swap that induces a shift from the relatively benign large buoyant LDL particles to the more harmful small dense ones. So if you spend a few years, decades, maybe banishing butter or cream cheese in favor of fat-free orange marmalade or grape jam on your bagel, you are unknowingly taking part in a dietary experiment that might have compromised your heart health. So much for following these official dietary guidelines. Clinical trials, where the research gets real. Most of the research we looked at so far was observational and epidemiological in nature. Let's switch gears now to look at clinical trials. Protocols for clinical trials in nutrition research vary, but generally speaking, these are studies in which two or more groups are assessed for various health issues or nutrient status. When they either follow their normal diet and lifestyle habits or implement some kind of change for a specified period of time, at the end of the day, they are assessed again to see what differences, if any, have resulted. Sometimes studies are designed to look for specific outcomes, like whether a low-carb diet results in more weight loss than a low-fat diet, or whether vitamin D supplements reduce risk for osteoporosis. These studies typically produce more reliable findings than epidemiological surveys, but they still have their weaknesses. The biggest of these is that it's almost impossible to control for all the factors that might have an effect on health. Factors completely unrelated to the diet or supplement changes, such as subjects' socioeconomic status, amount of exercise, quality and quantity of sleep, and level of education, just to name a few. It's also difficult to control for issues that are related to diet. For example, if only one change is made, such as reducing intake of red meat, what about all the other parts of subject's diet? They're likely not all eating and drinking the exact same things to begin with, and as we've seen, foods and nutrients don't exist in a vacuum. They interact with each other so that their effects are determined in part by what they're consumed with and in the context of the diet and lifestyle as a whole. Unless these things are controlled for, it's possible for study results to show connections that aren't really there. Researchers understand this and try to control for it. To level the playing field, so to speak, but it's not possible to completely neutralize every factor that might play a role in the results. Nevertheless, with the exception of double-blind placebo-controlled studies, which are virtually impossible to do with diets. You know whether or not you're eating more broccoli. These types of clinical trials, called interventional studies, are among the best tools we have for now. So let's look at a few of the more famous ones related to saturated and polyunsaturated fats. Were their findings cause for major changes in the American diet, or were they much ado about nothing? The Finnish Mental Hospital Study, FMHS, has consistently been used as evidence that industrial seed oils are good for heart health, as subjects who had an increased intake of these seed oils showed a lower risk of death from CHD. However, there were serious flaws in the study. The FMHS was a primary prevention trial conducted in middle-aged men, and two mental hospitals from trial conducted in middle-aged men in two mental hospitals from 1959 to 1971. Primary prevention means preventing the first occurrence of something like a heart attack or stroke. Secondary prevention means preventing a second instance. In one hospital, subjects were put on an omega-6 enriched diet, in which butter was replaced with PUFA enriched margarine and whole milk was replaced with milk fortified with soybean oil. Yum. Subjects in the other hospital were served the normal hospital diet without saturated fat being swapped out for omega-6. At the time, margarine was a major source of artificial trans fat, and it was removed in the omega-6 intervention group. So the omega-6 intervention wasn't just a reduced omega-6 intervention, but also a reduced artificial trans fat intervention. And this could have easily skewed the study's results in favor of omega-6. Artificial trans fats are created when liquid oils are chemically manipulated to behave more like solid fats. This is how margarine made from corn and soybean oils are solid at room temperature, and they definitely raise LDL levels. And then the diets were switched after 6 years, and patients were allowed to come in and out of the trial. So not everyone who started this study consumed both diets for 6 years. Moreover, the patients in the FMHS were not randomized, and there were differences between the two groups in blood pressure, cigarette smoking, and the use of psychotropic medications. Specifically, among the omega-6 group, fewer subjects were using antipsychotic medications that are toxic to the heart and are known to increase the risk of sudden death. These are the kinds of confounding variables that researchers are supposed to control for. Because the study subjects weren't randomized, the results favoring omega-6 could have been due to the reduction in industrial trans fats in the omega-6 group, or to the increased use of cardiotoxic drugs in the group on the normal diet, or simply just due to chance. You could roll dice and have odds about as good for guessing the outcome as you could in trying to ferret out which of the multiple factors at work might be responsible for the reduced deaths from CHD in the omega-6 diet group. One outcome we don't have to guess about the FMHS is not ironclad proof that consuming more omega-6 rich vegetable oils is good for the heart. Another study worth looking at is the Los Angeles Veterans Administration study. This was an 8-year randomized double-blind trial in over 800 male veterans with and without previously diagnosed CHD. Researchers compared a conventional diet with 40% of total calories from fat, mainly as animal fat, to an omega-6 enriched diet in which about 2/3 of the animal fat was replaced by vegetable oils, primarily corn, soybean, safflower, and cottonseed oils. Saturated fat intake in the conventional diet was 18% of total calories, compared to just 8% in the omega-6 diet, and polysaturated fat in the conventional diet was just 5% of total energy, compared to 16% in the omega-6 cohort. So what happened? Did replacing some of the animal fat in the subject's diet with vegetable oils make them immune to heart disease? Not really. Subjects who consumed the omega-6 enriched diet saw their cholesterol levels drop by 13%. But this reduction in cholesterol had no significant impact on heart attacks or sudden death. There were fewer fatal arteriosclerotic events in the omega-6 diet cohort, but this wasn't something the study was specifically designed to look for. It was a secondary exploratory issue. So, the study wasn't crafted to control for confounding factors. Even so, let's not sweep this important finding under the rug and pretend it doesn't exist. The way too many nutrition and health researchers tend to do with facts that may be uncomfortable. Okay, subjects who ate less saturated fat and more PUFAs experienced fewer arteriosclerotic events. Are there any plausible explanations for this besides just the difference in dietary fats? There are plenty. First, at the beginning of the study, the omega-6 group had fewer smokers overall, as well as fewer heavy smokers than the conventional diet group. In the omega-6 group, there were 99 non-smokers versus 86 in the conventional diet group. 38 people who smoked 1 to 2 packs a day in the omega-6 group compared to 57 in the conventional, and 7 2-pack or more per day smokers versus 13 2-pack a day smokers in the conventional group. Considering the extraordinarily harmful effects of smoking on the heart and the entire cardiovascular system, these differences aren't something to take lightly. Second, at the start of the study, the omega-6 group had fewer people who'd already had a heart attack in the conventional group, 327 versus 349 respectively, and fewer subjects suspected of having had a probable or possible heart attack as indicated by EKG. Finally, those in the omega-6 group had almost 10 times greater intake of vitamin E than those in the control group, with a much lower intake of vitamin E in the conventional diet group, an intake the researchers actually called distinctly deficient. These subjects were at increased risk for CH to begin with. Research on vitamin E and heart health indicates that vitamin E may reduce death from heart attacks. So, the lower vitamin E intake could have been responsible for the higher incidence of CHD among the conventional diet group. Combine that with the conventional diet group having more heavy smokers and worse subjects who already had documented evidence of poor heart health. This study was skewed in favor of the omega-6 group from the get-go. Trans fat intake was an additional co-founder here, just as it was in the Finnish mental hospital study we looked at previously. Trans fat consumption was restricted in the omega-6 group, but consumption was over 2 grams per day in the control group. Additionally, daily omega-3 intake as alpha-linolenic acid (ALA) was much higher in the omega-6 group compared to the conventional diet group, about 700 milligrams per day versus 100 milligrams per day, respectively. In fact, the control group was found to be overtly deficient in ALA. This study was riddled with shortcomings that might have confounded the results, and it cannot be used as evidence that we should limit our consumption of saturated fats and replace them with high omega-6 vegetable oils. Another very flawed bit of research was the Minnesota Coronary Survey. It ran for 4.5 years and was a double-blind, randomized clinical trial involving over 9,000 men and women institutionalized in 6 Minnesota state mental hospitals and 1 nursing home. If you're wondering why nutritional intervention studies are sometimes conducted in mental institutions, it's because it's easier to control people's diets that way when they live at home and may be less honest about strictly adhering to what researchers tell them to eat. This trial compared a controlled diet to a treatment diet that was lower in saturated fat, higher in polyunsaturated fat, and had about the same amount of monounsaturated fat but less cholesterol. Subjects spent an average of a little over a year on their prescribed diet. And how this turned out? Well, subjects in the treatment group, the one with less saturated fat and more polyunsaturated, saw their cholesterol decrease more than subjects eating the controlled diet. There were 269 deaths among the men and women in the omega-6 treatment group compared to 248 in the control group. So a few more deaths in the omega-6 group, but not enough to be considered significant in the research world. There was no increase in cardiovascular risk in men, but women in the omega-6 group saw alarming increases in death from CHD, plus 28%, non-fatal CHD events, plus 25%, and all-cause mortality, plus 17%. This trial clearly indicates that replacing saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, mainly in the form of omega-6 from margarine and vegetable oils, is unlikely to reduce cardiovascular risk and may actually increase the risk of CHD in women. Moreover, here again we have a study in which cholesterol generally went down, but at least in women, death from heart disease and from all causes went up. That's dust, as they say. Clinical trials were different findings. There have been plenty of clinical trials that have found opposite results to the trials above, but we don't hear so much about those. The anti-coronary club trial found that when saturated fat was replaced with omega-6, there was an increase in deaths from CHD and nearly a quadrupling of deaths from all causes. In fact, there was a 71% increased risk of death from causes other than CHD in those who replace saturated fat with omega-6. So this study suggests that when you decrease your saturated fat intake and increase your omega-6, exactly what you've been advised to do since the late 1970s, you have increased risk from heart disease as well as death from other causes. The rose corn study, corn oil and treatment of ischemic heart disease, found that subjects provided corn oil or olive oil had worse health outcomes than the control subjects. 80 patients with CHD were randomized to one of three diets: a control diet, a diet that restricted animal fat and supplemented with olive oil, and a diet restricted in animal fat and supplemented with corn oil rather than olive oil. By the end of the trial, the proportions of patients remaining alive and free of a fatal or non-fatal second heart attack were 75%, 57%, and 52% in the control, refined olive oil and corn oil groups respectively. This was despite the fact that subjects' cholesterol levels were lowered in the corn oil group. That plastic gallon jug of corn oil sitting on the bottom shelf of the supermarket probably seems a lot less appealing now, huh? Let them put it on sale. You don't want it no matter how cheap it is. Remember, many people who suffer heart attacks or other cardiovascular events have normal or even low cholesterol. This cannot be emphasized enough. Lowering cholesterol levels does not automatically confer protection against MI or CHD. So studies that purport to show vegetable oils being better for heart health than saturated animal fats solely because they lower people's cholesterol levels are houses of cards that fall apart easily. If you're wondering why you've spent so many years using artificially colored and flavored vegetable oil spreads instead of good old butter, you're not alone. In the Lion Diet Heart study, among subjects who had already experienced a heart attack, a Mediterranean diet that reduced omega-6 resulted in a 70% reduction in death and cardiovascular events compared to a traditional low-fat diet. That's right. This helpful Mediterranean diet provided fewer calories from omega-6 compared to the traditional diet. Intake of omega-3 ALA was slightly higher in the Mediterranean diet group. So what the Lion Diet Heart study showed was not that a high omega-6 intake is good for heart, but rather reducing the ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 reduces cardiovascular events and death. Considering the studies we've already looked at, this next part will come as no surprise. All of these benefits occurred without any significant reduction in cholesterol levels. PRODIMED was a large, randomized clinical trial in over 7,400 patients. Two Mediterranean diets were compared with a traditional low-fat diet. The two med diets consisted of dietary counseling plus 5 ounces of supplemental extra virgin olive oil, EVOO, per day, or dietary counseling and one source or 1 ounce of nuts, specifically walnuts, almonds, and hazelnuts. Walnuts are high in LA in ALA, whereas almonds and hazelnuts are high in MUFA. Thus, one med diet was high in MUFA from EVOO, and the other was a combination of increased MUFA from olive oil and omega-6 and omega-3 from the nuts. The low-fat diet emphasized reducing all types of fat, including olive oil, nuts, sausages, fatty meats, and fatty fish. Subjects on the low-fat diet were advised to eat lean meats, low-fat dairy, cereals, potatoes, pasta, rice, fruits, and vegetables. Compared to the low-fat diet, the med diet plus EVOO and the med diet plus nuts reduced heart attack, stroke, and death from cardiovascular causes by 30% and 28%, respectively. Death from any cause, not just cardiovascular issues, was slightly lower in the med diet plus EVOO compared to the low-fat diet. Subjects in all three diets consumed approximately the same amount of fish and seafood, so differences in intake of the marine omega-3s, EPA and DHA, were most likely not responsible for the benefits seen with the two med diets compared to the low-fat diet. Monounsaturated fat was a bit higher in the two med diets versus the low-fat diet, but only slightly. Changes in LA intake also don't explain the benefits in the med diets, since LA intake decreased in the med diet plus EVOO, but increased in the med diet plus nuts. Yet both diets showed benefits for our heart health and overall mortality. So what was the protective factor here? The main dietary change that occurred in the med diet plus EVOO compared to the low-fat control diet was a big reduction in refined mixed olive oil and an increase in higher quality EVOO. The total intake of EVOO in the med diet plus EVOO was approximately 50 grams per day, about 1.7 ounces. Similar but less dramatic changes occurred in the med diet plus nuts group, with a reduction in refined olive oil and an increase in EVOO. In the med diet plus nuts group, total EVOO intake was around 32 grams per day, 1.1 ounces. Compared to the low-fat diet, both med diets had substantially greater increases in EVOO intake. The key takeaway from this study is that complete elimination of refined olive oil and increased intake of better quality EVOO was the factor most likely responsible for the health benefits observed in the two med diets. The med diet plus nuts group may have also derived benefits from the nuts. Interestingly, even though the low-fat diet was intended as just that, low fat, but not specifically low in calories, the low-fat group did end up consuming fewer calories than both of the med diets. Despite being higher in calories, the two Mediterranean diets were better for overall health and cardiovascular health in particular than the low-fat diet. Kind of makes you regret passing up a beautiful fatty piece of traditionally cured prosciutto in favor of a dry, skinless chicken breast. The benefits of the med diet plus EVOO group occurred with a linoleic acid intake of exactly 5% of total calories, the very bottom of the range some researchers recommend you eat. This study showed that cardiovascular events can be reduced without increasing LA. And cardiovascular events can be reduced when LA intake makes up just 5% of total calories. So here you have two randomized control trials, the Lion Diet Heart Study and Predimed, that tested Mediterranean diets, the results of which do not support the AHA's recommendation that you should get at least 5% to 10% of your total calories from omega-6 linoleic acid. Hungry for healthy fats? Be generous with the EVOO on your salad and maybe sprinkle some walnuts on top too. Omega-3 studies. We spent some time scrutinizing studies related to omega-6 fats. Let's shift over now to the research on omega-3s. Prior to 2005, studies testing marine omega-3s from fish or as EPA DHA supplements had consistently shown reductions in CHD and overall mortality. However, more recent studies have failed to confirm these findings, muddying the waters and creating confusion among people who want to improve their health. It's troubling that the headlines are so contradictory. We need to get things right here because this has big implications both for what you eat and how you budget your supplement dollars. Are EPA and DHA good for you or bad? Does wild-caught salmon deserve its reputation as a superfood? It's enough to make you want to give up and head for the nearest fast food joint, but don't do that. Many of these recent studies suddenly questioning the benefits of omega-3s were plagued by weaknesses and confounding factors. These shortcomings explain the discrepancies between them and the earlier research. These problems include 1. Insufficient omega-3 done used. If the studies had given higher doses of omega-3 to people who were in need of it, it might have shown benefit. Number 2. High intake of omega-6. Remember, omega-3 and omega-6 fats perform a balancing act. When omega-6 intake is high, more omega-3 is needed to counteract it. Number 3. Concurrent medical treatments. Certain medications or other treatments may interfere with the effects of omega-3 or prevent omega-3s from having the effects they would otherwise have in the absence of those factors. Number 4. Too short a follow-up period. Health doesn't transform magically overnight. Changes in fat intake, whether from foods or supplement, may take a while to set in, and studies might simply be too short in duration to account for this. Number 5. Lack of statistical power to show benefit. Studies might have had too few subjects or too few data points to provide accurate and reliable results. On the other hand, the earlier studies in support of the beneficial effects of EPA and DHA were not compromised by these problems, so let's look at some of them in detail. The diet and reinfarction trial, DART, found that among patients with a history of heart attack, those given advice to increase fatty fish intake had a 29% reduction in 2-year all-cause mortality compared to those who did not receive such advice. Those who could not tolerate eating fish were given an omega-3 supplement containing EPA and DHA, which reduced all-cause mortality by over 50%. The GISA Prevention (GISA-P) trial was a randomized controlled trial testing an EPA-DHA supplement in more than 11,000 patients who had recently experienced a heart attack. Those receiving the supplement had significant reductions in non-fatal second heart attacks, stroke, and death, as well as a 30% reduction in death from cardiovascular issues, and a 45% reduction in sudden cardiac death. The same omega-3 done was used in another Italian randomized controlled trial, GISA heart failure. Testing omega-3s in nearly 7,000 patients with heart failure and those receiving the supplement, all-cause mortality as well as hospitalizations for cardiovascular reasons were significantly reduced. That's a pretty impressive track record for some humble fats. In a Japanese study of more than 18,000 patients with high cholesterol, 1,800 milligrams of EPA per day reduced the incidence of sudden